Well, good afternoon and welcome to our session session 5 of our back to school webinar series from the News Literacy Project. We are very thankful for the generous support of the Knight Foundation to make this webinar series possible so that we can bring this professional learning to you as well as all of the resources associated with it free of charge. This evening, we're going to be talking about news media bias. And most importantly, we're going to talk about a new sort of framework or new approach to discussing news media bias in the classroom. So my name is John Silva. I'm part of the professional and community learning team here at the News Literacy Project. Our primary role is to do exactly like we're doing this evening, provide professional learning opportunities for educators. Our team also does learning opportunities and sessions for adult audiences, particularly with community and civic organizations. I've been with NLP for a little over 5 years, and I was a social studies teacher here in Chicago for 13 years before I joined NLP. If you'd like to reach out to me after this evening's session, my email address is there at the lower left of your screen, and you can follow me on social media on Twitter at Mr. Silva. In the session with me, but she's going to be in the chat, is my colleague Alexa Volland. She'll be dropping links and such as we go along. One of the most important things we want to understand when we're talking about news literacy, but also with news media bias and some of these, is the important connection between news literacy skills and being an active and engaged participant in the civic life of your community. You cannot be an active participant if you are not credibly and reliably informed. And understanding news media bias is actually an essential component of the broader news literacy skills. So first off, it's really important for us to have a good definition of what we mean by news media bias. Obviously, we do know that bias in general is about favoring one side or over another, right? Where things are skewed to one perspective over another. But when we're talking about news media bias, it's really important to understand that the emphasis is on news reporting, not other types of information. Like what we talked about in session 1, the difference between information that informs us, which is news, and other types of information that are influencing us. As we'll talk about, discussions of bias on that information that's influencing us is kind of pointless. One thing that makes it kind of difficult to have a careful and deliberate conversation about news media bias is the fact that a lot of sort of bias curriculum and bias assessments that are out there have some sort of problematic questions, the way they approach it. Some of these questions are actually quite leading, right? So if you say, where is the bias, right? You're saying like, look for it, and with students, they will kind of look and see whatever they think they can see to answer the question. And some of these questions can skew towards being cynical, right? So if you just assume that all information, all news has a hidden meaning, or if you're trying to figure out that there's an intent behind a piece of news other than informing us, that's edging towards cynicism. And one of the things that we want to emphasize is actually about healthy skepticism. So we actually have some questions that we put together with our curriculum that's designed to sort of foster a more careful and deliberate approach to evaluating information to see if there is a particular types of bias. So some of the things that we want to talk about is really what is news media bias and the importance of recognizing that these discussions are most relevant to news reporting. And also questioning about, when we do see bias, is it always intentional? Is there always a purpose behind it? Or can it be more about our perceptions or something that just kind of happened? And when we talk about perceptions, what is the role of our perceptions when we're evaluating information for bias? And how can we really trust our perceptions? And then when we talk about, obviously, partisan bias, we often frame it as left or right, liberal, conservative. Is there a center? What is it? And how do we define it? And then also kind of broadly, the idea that maybe not all bias is actually politically partisan. So this is an example that we have. So on the screen are two news articles from two different news sources about the same story. What I'd like you to do is take a close look and try to see just not really what in particular might be biased, but which one do you think would be less biased than the other, right? So we have two different news articles. These are both news. They're both from standards-based news organizations. And so which one? So we have this quiz where we're going to take a look. And so this is on Mentimeter, and we're going to ask you to go ahead and take a look at that. So the thing is that we would probably look towards example A as being more biased than article B, right? Because A includes things like the pastor is known for wearing designer outfits, extravagant jewelry, right? So one of the important questions is that, so is that showing some sort of bias? Is the inclusion of that information showing any particular kind of bias, or is it important to the details of the story? So most of us would probably look at example B and say it is less biased because it's more direct, it's more to the point. But what if we know where these news or where this news comes from? What if we know who the sources are? So it's really important for us to take a look and to sort of see who these news organizations are, because if we know who the news organizations are, our perceptions of those news organizations will inevitably influence how we take a look at this. And so this is where we need to have a conversation about unconscious bias. So here's another example where we need to be very careful about what it is that we're evaluating. So when we take a look at these two articles, there is one that is obviously more biased than the other. And it's really essential for us to really think about what it is we're looking at, because the reality is the article on the left is a news piece. The one on the right is an opinion piece. And so this is where it's really important to, before you start having a conversation about news media bias, you need to be able to sort of recognize, am I looking at an opinion piece or am I looking at news? Because if it's opinion, then again, conversations about bias are kind of pointless, because there is so much information out there that is inherently biased. When we think about the volume of news and information that is out there that we see, right? So much of it is about influencing us. It's about trying to get us to think a certain way or support a certain position. It's not about informing us. And so this is where, when we start having some of these conversations about bias, we're accusing people of being biased, but the reality is they're supposed to be. One tool that a lot of people use when we have these conversations about news media bias is media bias charts. So there are several of them out there. So this is the one from Ad Fontes Media. It is kind of a complex chart, but it is partisan. It's about politically partisan. It's about being left or right. So it's only focused on partisanship, and it evaluates that way, but also sort of the difference between original fact reporting or fact reporting, and then down to like misleading or inaccurate information. So this is one example. There's another one from All Sides, which I actually like a little bit more than the Ad Fontes Media, because it does distinguish between opinion and news, right? So if you look at this, it says CNN News Only, CNN Opinion, Fox Online News Only, Fox News Opinion. So it is making that distinction, but it's still kind of lumping all information together. And this is what's kind of problematic and really the limiting factors of these media bias charts. They can be a helpful starting point in some circumstances, but the thing is they're really only focused on political bias, about partisanship. And most of these determinations are about the opinion pieces, the commentary, which are supposed to be biased. And so there's a lot of ways that these are debatable, and you know, our perception is very much a part of this. And as we mentioned earlier, our perceptions can be fueled by unconscious bias. And so when this says like the certain news organization is hyper partisan right or hyper partisan right or left, it could reinforce those unconscious biases because that's kind of how we view it. But it's also really problematic to compare some of these news organizations or some of these organizations in the same chart, right? If we have like Reuters and the Associated Press and, you know, some of these that have original reporting, these news organizations that are pretty much only reporting news, they don't have a lot of opinion content. But if we compare those to things like InfoWars or, you know, hyper-partisan blogs like Wonkette, right? The idea that we can try to compare these two on one chart is kind of problematic. And because the reality is so many of these sources, they aren't trying to be neutral. They are trying to be biased in a very specific way. And so if we look for bias in some of these sources, of course we're going to find it. And it's why we go to some of these sources. And so an essential component of this is we need to kind of stop thinking about news media biases only being left or right or liberal conservative, right? We need to kind of move past that, and we need to think about, you know, how are things biased and are they less or more? Making this difficult is when we talk about objectivity or that sources need to be objective. Objectivity is a lofty ideal. It's something that we absolutely should strive for, but in a way, objectivity sets an impossibly high standard because we can never completely eliminate bias. We can never be completely objective in these things. And so one of the important ways that we want to frame this with students and when we're talking about this is that we want to realize that standards-based news organizations are trying to be fair and accurate. And by thinking about fairness and accuracy, that can get us away from that simplified binary approach. So I'm going to pause here for questions, and I'm going to see if other people are having getting into the session. We've been having some technical difficulties, so I want to just appreciate your patience while we do this. The session is being recorded, and we will be sending a copy of the slides to everyone who registered. So you'll be able to get caught up on the first 15 minutes or so of the session for those of you that were able to join us. And again, I apologize deeply for the technical problems we've been having. So one of the most important resources we have for teaching bias and news media bias is our Understanding Bias lesson in the Checkology virtual classroom. It is a comprehensive lesson that takes students through this idea that we need to move away from our perceptions. We need to emphasize the importance of evaluating bias in news and not other types of information. But then it's also the framework that we need to give them clear ideas of what to look for. So we've created first what we call our 5 types of bias, right? So these are the ways that biases creep into news coverage, or sometimes they can be overt. But this is where we can identify clear types of bias that are fairly common. And I'm going to go through and show you some examples in the lesson. And Alexa dropped a link to that. We have an infographic that you can use with this. So one of the most common is what we call demographic bias. So this is an example that's from the lesson, and it's the idea that a journalist from a major metropolitan area is covering something in a rural community, and he describes them as a simple, God-fearing slice of America, right? Well, it's an oversimplification of an entire group of people, right? This idea that all these people in rural areas are simple and God-fearing, right? So with this simplistic viewpoint, he's actually showing a demographic bias that's kind of creeped into how he frames his story. Another one that's also very, very common is called neutrality bias. This happens when news organizations and journalists try really hard to avoid bias, and in doing so, they actually express a unique kind of bias, right? So in this case, so this example, we have a social media manager posts a story about a climate change report. And in the post, she has the caption, "Is climate man-made? Question mark. Click here to find out." But if you click there and you read the story, it actually doesn't have, it's not a question, right? The findings are evidence that it is in fact the result of human activity. So in trying to avoid bias, right, to suggest that there are people who don't believe that climate change is the result of human activity, right? So they're trying to be neutral, but they've actually shown this unique kind of bias. And obviously, partisan bias is a very real problem. A lot of bias is actually in many ways partisan. So this example, you have a morning news show producer gives more airtime to their presidential candidate, the one that they support in their platform. They give them more airtime than other candidates, right? So by giving that more airtime, that's an expression of partisan bias. And we don't always know if it's intentional or not. So it's really difficult for us to do that. That's why we have these definitions, is that we're not saying that they did this deliberately. What we're saying is that they did it, right? It's an example of partisan bias. The next one is corporate bias. So this is something that gets talked about in a lot of media literacy curriculum focused on news media bias. It's this idea that when a news organization has a corporate owner, that there's some sort of influence. Now, most standards-based news organizations, there is a firewall between the newsroom and the business office. There's a firewall between ownership and the actual newsroom. But sometimes it does come through. So this is an example. The editors at a local news outlet kind of bury allegations of corruption from their parent company. Instead of putting it on the front page like other news organizations do, they put it in, they do a very short story and bury it in the business section. So this is corporate bias. This is where decisions about news coverage is influenced by a parent company. And then another one is big story bias. This happens really frequently in breaking news events. It's this idea. So this example, there's a breaking news event, and they break into the television coverage that say the Coast Guard is firing at a vessel on the Ohio River, and other news organizations pick up on it. But they reported on it too soon because they thought it was a major news story, and they wanted to report it first. They wanted to break the news first. They rushed it, and they didn't verify things. And that's what we call big story bias. This one's another example of neutrality bias that I just want to mention, because I'll do something else with the example. So we have a journalist writing a story about immigration policy. The journalist has strong opinions about it because he doesn't want his personal opinions to sort of be expressed in the reporting. He includes these stories and other things for things he doesn't agree with, but he only does one for a spokesperson that supports him, right? So he's trying so hard to not be biased that he's actually skewing the coverage in a way that's problematic. So those are the 5 types, but there's different ways that they can be expressed. And so we also have these 5 forms. So the types and forms work together in different combinations for how they appear. So we have the types that we define them, and then the ways they appear can be very different. So the demographic bias of the urban journalist, we would describe this as tone, right? The word choice that he uses to describe people and the tone of how he describes people, that's the form that this demographic bias takes. Tone is very common, right? The vocabulary of news matters very much, and the words that we choose can actually show different types of bias. Framing is another type of form that's also very common. So here, by framing it as a question when it's actually not a question, right? That's how we're expressing this neutrality bias. So taking something that is actually definitive, you have the scientific report that says climate change is human made, right? But by framing it as a question, that's how that neutrality bias was expressed. When we have an absence of fairness and balance, this is where, in this case, we had the partisan bias by giving more screen time to one than the others, right? We're not being fair to all the candidates. We're not giving a balanced time and coverage to the candidates. So this is the way that partisan bias is expressed. The corporate bias we would call story selection. So if one news organization chooses not to cover a story, or they minimize coverage in a way when others don't, that's story selection bias. In this case, corporate bias in the form of story selection. The big story bias is also an example of story selection, right? Because they choose to run it quickly, they chose to emphasize it, a breaking news event, when they should have waited, and in the end turned out to be a very minor story. That's another example of story selection. And then the last one, this was the other neutrality bias. This is what we call flawed sourcing. If we use problematic sources, or if we favor sources from one perspective over others, the flawed sourcing is the way that this can be expressed. So I'll pause here to see if there are any questions from a couple of you that have managed to join us. Alexa is posting those links while I see if anybody wants to ask any questions. I'm going to see if anybody else is trying to get in. Okay. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. Since a couple of you managed to join us late, I am going to go back and kind of introduce some of the concepts from the beginning, so we can at least cover some of that, so you don't necessarily have to go back and watch the recording for the first part. How does that sound? So one of the things that we started off with was trying to have just a definition of what we mean by news media bias. The important aspect of this, when we talk about news media bias, and we're trying to have a careful and deliberate approach to this, is the fact that discussions of bias really need to only apply to news reporting. If you attended our first session where we talked about the difference between information that informs us versus information that is influencing us, right? Conversations about those influencing sources, they're supposed to be biased. So one of the most important things that we have to start with is that if we're going to learn about and discuss news media bias, we have to focus on news reporting. So information that is being published by standards-based news organizations. What's difficult is a lot of the times when we do try to have conversations about news media bias, the questions actually can be problematic. The questions themselves, they can very often be leading, like, where is the bias? So if you ask a student to look at something and say, where is the bias? They're going to look, and they're going to be kind of creative in trying to come up with the answer, because they assume that there must be, if you're asking where is the bias, there must be something there. So they're actually going to be kind of creative, and they're going to sort of read into things, talking about how things feel, and then some of them kind of edge in away from skepticism and into more cynical approaches to this, right? The idea that a news report, there's a hidden meaning behind it, that there should be some intent other than informing us, right? We have to be careful with some of these questions because they could encourage a more cynical perspective. So we have some guiding questions, some essential questions for how we try to frame this that can get us to a more nuanced discussion, right? So having a common understanding of what is news media bias, right? We want to understand what we're talking about, and but also like what is it and who makes the decisions. We want to talk about whether or not bias that we see in news coverage is intentional or not, or is it just something that we perceive? And if we're perceiving it, how much can we trust our perceptions, or are we sort of reading into things from our own bias perspective? And then when inevitably when we talk about bias being left or right, is there a center? What is the center? How do we define it? Who decides what the center is? And then the other question on which we want to talk about is like, is all bias actually partisan? So I'm going to use this example. So we have this example. This is a story. This is two news stories from two news sources. I want you to take a look at these two examples, and I want you to kind of think about which one, not how or in what way, but which one do you think is less biased? So you can either, so we have this set up as a Mentimeter, but we don't necessarily have to use this since there's only a few of us. In the chat, if you could just sort of put in there either A or B, which one do you think is less biased? So taking a look at this, we might look at the example A, and we might see that they've added detail about the pastor known for wearing designer outfits and extravagant jewelry. We might see the inclusion of that as being more biased than the one on the right, Article B, which is more direct and to the point. One question we would have to ask is the inclusion of those details germane to the actual story? Why is chat disabled? We are having all sorts of difficulties. So we will look into what's going on with the chat here in a minute. So that's how we might take a look at this. That's how we might evaluate it, right? But take a look at it now. And so the first question is why, think about why did I blur out the news sources? But think about how you might have interpreted these differently had you known where these articles were from. We would have inevitably had, we would have read into this based on our perceptions of Fox News and CNN. And so we have to think about how our own perceptions can influence our evaluations of bias, because unconscious biases are a major factor in how we have these conversations. We would see a particular logo, we would see certain wording, we might even see a certain picture, and we would make a quick judgment based on our own unconscious beliefs. And then, so this is another example where we have two different articles about roughly the same story. Which one do we think might be? Oh, here we go. I think I have the chat turned on. Okay, hopefully this works. So take a look at these two. Which one do you think is less biased? The one on the left or the one on the right? Hopefully somebody else can chat. I think I got it fixed. So Amber says the one on the left. I think, yeah, it is pretty clear, right? When we have, like, we talk about a right-wing echo chamber, and then saying that people are spreading lies. Here's the most important thing to recognize. The Mother Jones article, the one on the right, is an opinion piece. And so when we look at that and we say that this is, when we make this accusation that they are more biased than the other one, it's because one is a news story that's informing us and the other one's trying to influence us. And so this is what's really important as an essential starting point. And I know I've said this a few times, but it's really important to emphasize is that when we're going to have these conversations about news media bias, we have to focus on news. Because most of what we see out there is going to be biased in some way. It's because it's trying to influence us. So we have to make sure we can differentiate news from other types of information. Now, I know that a lot of people recommend and will use media bias charts. And so I want to sort of emphasize some of the limitations and express some caution about how we use media bias charts. So, the Ad Fontes media chart, it's been around for a long time. It's one of the most detailed out there, right? But it is focused mainly on partisanship, left or right, and it does talk about original fact reporting down to inaccurate or fabricated information. It's a very complicated chart to try to get through. All Sides also has one. I think it's a little bit more useful. I do like how they differentiate between opinion and news, but as I said, trying to compare opinion pieces with news pieces in the same chart, this is where things get problematic with these media bias charts, because they pretty much only focus on partisanship, right? They only focus on, is it left or right, is it liberal or is it conservative? But they also, when they're making these evaluations, most of the determination is based off of the opinion content, right? And so we expect it to be. There's a lot of ways that these can be debated. We can have different arguments about different sources. Our perceptions are also a major factor in this, and in an important way, when we see this, if we see a certain news organization and it's in a certain place on the chart, and that we already believe that, then that's just reinforcing our own biases. But where I think they are most problematic, first, is that they are comparing widely different organizations, right? The idea that you can compare an organization like the Associated Press with say, InfoWars, that promotes wild conspiracy theories and spreads, is rampant at spreading misinformation and disinformation, or compare the Associated Press to a hyper-partisan blog like Wonkette. That's what they do. They're only there to put out, political content from a very specific point of view. To try to put all of these together in one chart, it's really difficult and problematic to sort of create this false equivalence. But also the idea that every piece of content in these with these organizations follows the same ideology is also kind of problematic. The idea that every piece of commentary that we would see from a news organization would be left or right, when actually a lot of them actually have multiple perspectives. And so I kind of sum up with this to sort of say, like, with a lot of these sources, we expect there to be bias. We kind of want there to be bias because we go to some of these sources for these viewpoints, and we need to try to be careful of that. And so an important thing that we want to move towards is trying to get away from only thinking about bias in terms of left or right, about liberal or conservative. What we want to try to think about is more of a spectrum about bias, if it's something is less or more biased, and then the ways. And that's where those types and forms of bias come into play. And then also, when we think about this concept of objectivity, the idea that everything needs to be completely objective is kind of impossible. It sets a very, very high bar. We should aspire to be more objective in news reporting, but in a way, it's kind of impossible to reach. So the way we want to think about this is not about being objective or being unbiased. We want to think about, are these standards-based news organizations being fair and accurate in their news reporting? And I think this idea of fairness and accuracy is a more important way of thinking about news media bias and the ways that bias can be expressed. So I'll pause here to see if there are some questions from that. So that was actually the intro to the session. Some people ended up missing the first part because of our technical difficulties. So I will just pause here to see if there are any questions. Hopefully you can put something in the chat if you need to. You're very welcome, Shirley. Fortunately, we had some time on this, and I knew exactly where we had paused, and so we can adapt. The unofficial motto of our professional and community learning team is Semper Gumby, which is always flexible. Paul, you're very welcome. I'm glad you can join us. Again, this is being recorded, so we're going to share the recording with everyone. And there will also be a copy of the slides sent out to everyone. Okay, so I want to this gets us to kind of the last little section, is some of the other ways where we can sort of see bias that can be kind of problematic, that it can fall into some of the categories of the types and forms. But there's just a couple that I want to mention that are really important. One is when we sort of say uncritically amplifying officials. There is a lot of times when we see a news report about a story and it is based off of what official sources have said, right? So in this case, police say the fatal shooting of Dante Wright was accidental, right? So if we're reporting that this is what the police say, but we're not actually being critical about it, if we're not actually questioning it and getting multiple perspectives, if we're just reporting what the police have said, right, we're giving extra weight to that voice, right? And it can be from really any official source, although it is frequently with some stories from like a police source. And here's another one with the police chief, right? But this happens a lot, this idea that an official source has released some information, they've said something, and so we're reporting it, but we're not really asking important questions. We're not getting multiple perspectives. We're just reporting what they said. That can be problematic because we're giving outsized voice or giving more weight to these official sources when we actually haven't really worked to confirm that what they're saying is actually true. Another aspect of news coverage that can be problematic is passive voice. So this is an article from a story about two teenage girls who were trying to carjack and rob an Uber Eats driver, and they assaulted him with a taser, and the driver, this caused an accident, and the driver was killed. But here we say this led to an accident, right? That's a very passive voice that really sort of downplays the idea that these two young women assaulted him with a taser, and that's what caused the accident, right? That killed him. And then also things like this. This is another example of it. Was killed in a crash. This Pakistani immigrant grandfather was killed in a crash. Actually, yes, he was killed in a crash, but he was actually in effect murdered by these two girls, right? They caused his death. So like this passive voice, it happens a lot. This is another example. So this is from back in March. You look at the headline and the tweet: Scottsboro officer killed, wife critically injured after the shooting. This actually doesn't really give us a lot of detail, but what we found out is that this was actually a murder-suicide. And this news organization had to update this. They had to issue this correction, right? So the difference between this officer killed, wife critically injured, is very different than he shoots his wife and then kills himself. So one thing that's important to remember here is that reputable news organizations, standards-based news organizations, if they are called out on their bias, if they're called out on this, they should correct things. They should issue corrections. It's really important to look out for that. And so passive voice is also very, very common. This last section, these last examples that I want to share with you are actually from yesterday, when news came out that Kenneth Starr was killed or died as a result of a long illness. And so obituaries, I think, are a really interesting case study in bias. So for example, one of the big questions when we look at obituaries is, are they just reporting the facts of the person's death and and their life, and like what makes them notable. So one really important question, like, is this factual? Is this still factual reporting in this story about the person's death? But also, how do they highlight this person and their life and their accomplishments, and how much coverage do they get, right? So this is from the New York Times. So when they reported it, they put out this breaking news tweet that Ken Starr had died. And they obviously highlight that he was the independent counsel that his investigation eventually led to President Clinton's impeachment. And it says he died on Tuesday, he was 76. But in the newspaper, all that they give, it's in the very lower right hand corner of the front page is just his picture and a caption, and then a link to this, and then it says the story is in section B. So it's a breaking news. It's highlighted on the Twitter feed, but it's actually a very for the New York Times. It's actually a very minor. In this case, it doesn't warrant full front page coverage. Compare that to the Washington Post. The Washington Post, same thing. They put out a tweet that he had died. They emphasized that he was an independent counsel. They give less details, but they actually put the first part of the story on the front page of the newspaper. It was in the center below the fold. So the Washington Post has actually given more prominence to this story than the New York Times. And so there could be some interesting questions about why did the Post put it in this way on the front page, but the New York Times didn't? Does that say something about the Washington Post? Are they expressing a bias with story selection, or more about the New York Times by putting it in section B? The third one is with the Houston Chronicle. They still say Ken, right? Ken Starr. Another interesting thing is, like, his name is Kenneth. Like, why do we shorten it this way? But the Houston Chronicle emphasizes that he was the ex-president of Baylor University, and so that's actually they actually put that more prominently in their coverage, obviously because Baylor University is in the Houston area. So and this was also on the front page. But it's also important to differentiate between a news story that's telling us the details, it's informing us about the death of a prominent person and details about their life. But sometimes we can cross over into editorializing. And so we can sort of take a look at some of these and realize that this isn't informing us about it. This is really emphasizing certain pieces in there, and they're expressing very clear viewpoints. And so talking about bias, we could talk about how these are biased and why, but they're not trying to be neutral. They are trying to be, they're very clearly expressing a viewpoint. And so calling it out as bias is kind of pointless because it's very clear. I will talk about the rail strike in just a second. What I want to mention is a really great resource for this. So the screenshots from the newspapers are from today's front pages, which is part of the Freedom Forum, which is also part of the museum. This is updated every day with PDFs of the front pages of newspapers, not only from around the United States, but also from around the world. And so if you want to have some great resources for starting some of these discussions, is you can download newspapers from around the country. You can also find them from around your state, your region, and kind of compare the language of headlines, compare what stories were covered in one but not covered in another, compare the images that were selected to illustrate a story, and it's updated every day. So each day you can download a whole new set of front pages. They're downloadable as PDFs. You can also save them as image files. It's completely free. Like I said, they update them every day. They're really great resources. There's a lot of other things at the Freedom Forum, at the museum, but I love the Today's Front Pages resource. There's a lot of really cool stuff that you can use that for. And Alexa dropped a link to that in the chat. Okay, so let me get to Paul's question about media bias relating to unions and worker organizing. as a former member of the Chicago Teachers Union, who I was very proud to walk the picket in 2012, and I saw, I saw how they covered our strike. I think one way that something like this would often be expressed is like, is the framing of the story. So, for example, with this impending rail worker strike, are they giving more coverage to the negative consequences that might happen if there is a strike, right? There's going to be a very real economic impact if this strike happens, right? Are we talking about commuters being inconvenienced? It's like, for example, here in Chicago, they're talking about the fact that people's commutes might be disrupted because there may be fewer commuter trains running. Are we talking about the economic impact on corporations of a strike? Or are we talking about the benefits that these union workers are trying to strike, why they're striking? Are we talking about their working conditions? Are we talking about labor laws? Are we talking about, wages and benefits? Like, are we talking about like why the strike is happening? What's the emphasis? But also with organizing, right? There's lots of places where people are trying to organize. So, for example, like Starbucks, there's a few Starbucks locations that have successfully organized. Are we only talking about it from the Starbucks perspective, or are we more talking about it from the union organizers' perspective, or is it more balanced? We want to see that fairness and that accuracy in the reporting. And so that's a bit about how this works. And then we can look at the language, right? So for example, I was listening to the radio earlier, and they were saying that these unions of the rail workers, they were asking for a 24% pay increase. But that's actually not, and that's like very narrowly described, right? It's not like they're going to have their pay like all of a sudden bumped up 24%, right? That's a gradual increase over the life of a contract, right? So the way they describe, they say worker demands, right? So what's the phrasing? So there's a lot of interesting ways that can be expressed, and I think the framing of it is important. The sources, like, are we giving more voice to the people who don't want the strike or don't want to give in to union demands? Are we portraying the union workers in a sympathetic way, or are we portraying them in a greedy way? So there are some interesting things, and here in Chicago, especially during that strike, it was the first major teacher strike in Chicago in years, right? And some of our coverage was pretty favorable. It was sort of talking about the things that we were seeking in a way that that was more fair and accurate, and sort of talking about like what we wanted, what the city was willing to do, and the way negotiations were going. But other outlets were kind of portraying us as the greedy union thugs. So it's very difficult. So I hope that kind of gets you some ideas to think about, Paul. So also with Amazon, I think I think a great example with Amazon would be working conditions, right? So like if we're talking about Amazon workers trying to unionize, and we just sort of say that they're trying to improve working conditions, but we don't actually describe why, right? If we don't describe like why they want to improve their working conditions and in what ways they want to see those improvements, right? Because I think there's a lot of problematic ways that a lot of workers are being treated. Working conditions in places that are not unionized can be very problematic. But if we only say that if we don't try to describe like why they're asking for this and what they're asking for, then we're missing out on some really important details. Okay, so the last thing I want to reiterate, I mentioned this at the very beginning. News literacy in general, but also news media bias in particular, is an essential component of trying to foster and encourage civic engagement in our students. If we're going to be informed in a way that's reliable and credible, we need to make sure that we're emphasizing sources that are informing us and are doing it in a way that is fair and accurate. And and recognizing that there are some sources that we could go to that could help us understand issues better, because they are trying to influence us in some ways, but we want to look at the ways that they're doing that. So it's really important to really get to this deeper understanding of how we're doing. So that is kind of the nutshell of what we've been talking about. I know it was kind of disjointed the way we did this, the way people joined. Okay. Oh, you're very welcome, Paul. Yeah, so this is that is the challenge, right? Is that if news organizations are only covering certain aspects, but they're not covering all the relevant aspects, right? That's story selection. That's sort of omitting important details. That's it could also be flawed sourcing if they're only talking about it from one particular viewpoint. So that's, yeah, I mean, that's where you can kind of call it out. But this is where it's important to sort of say that, not just saying that these news organizations are being biased. It's more effective and I think more powerful if we can specifically call it out as a certain type of bias, right? This is showing bias because they are omitting these important details. They're not being fair and accurate. And that's how we can do it. I would say, but I would also say, good luck with your organizing efforts. I hope you can make some progress. So Alexa and I will stay on for a couple of more minutes to see if anybody has any additional questions or things that you would like me to talk about. Again, we'll send this recording out to everyone, and we will make sure that everybody gets a copy of the slides. So that's it for us. Like I said, I'll stay on for a couple minutes. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your patience. I'm very sorry for the difficulties. Hopefully we will be able to have this resolved for our final session next week. We have a session with some journalists from the Center for Public Integrity. We're going to be talking about some investigative journalism aspects, and that's going to wrap up our back to school webinar series, which we are very thankful for the support from the Knight Foundation to be able to produce this. So thank you, everyone. I hope your school years are going well. Please get in touch with us if you would like some support from us, if you need additional resources. I'm going to drop my email address in the chat. And you can reach out to me directly if you'd like to follow up. So thank you very much for joining us. I hope you have a lovely evening. And hopefully we will see you next week. And we are going to make sure we send out the links in advance. We'll make sure we're on top of that. So thank you for your understanding. And have a very good night.